Pentagon papers, Pentagon papers.
In 1971, a New York Times report was published that completely changed United States history. It all started with a man named Daniel Ellsberg. Ellsberg had previously returned home to the United States after working in Vietnam in international security affairs. When he came home, he began working for the Rand Corporation, where he was exposed to information that revealed the truth behind the Vietnam War. During the mid-1950s to 1970s, the United States was involved in a war between the communist north half of Vietnam and the nationalist south half of Vietnam.
United States helicopters in South Vietnam poised for an Eagle flight, a way of airlifting government troops to root out Red Viet Cong guerrillas in the Camao Peninsula.
With tensions against the Soviets and the need for containment of communism, the United States was actively supporting the nationalist half of Vietnam. As the war went on, Americans back home were constantly being told by the media and by the government that we were succeeding in the war and that victory was close. In reality, the things the government was saying were primarily lies and mistruths. For example, the United States lied to its citizens about death counts and lied that they would not be expanding the war when they were actually bombing many villages and many towns in secret.
I had to go through a year of hell, seeing my friends die, seeing women and children killed.
We had blood on our hands. We decided that it has to stop.
I just felt I had a moral obligation to protest this war, to bring the reality of this war to America.
At his time working for the Rand Corporation, Ellsberg was infuriated by the government's lies and decided that he had to do something about it. Over the course of a few weeks, Daniel snuck out and photocopied many of the Pentagon paper files, which were a series of millions of classified documents that contained the real truth behind the war. Ellsberg connected with the New York Times reporter Neil Sheehan, and after a lot of debate, the New York Times decided to go through and publish the cold truth behind the war. A big question that this event has led to is, how did it shape American society? Well, although the release of the Pentagon Papers did compel the government to be more transparent with the citizens, it served an even greater role as a catalyst that deepened the divide between the government and the American people by fueling distrust, opening the door for future whistleblowers, and eroding public support for the Vietnam War. This document is a section from Sheehan's original article that shows how the release of the papers heavily increased the divide between the government and its people. In the document, you can see how the United States government privately recognized the hardships of the conflict, while publicly showing optimism and confidence to the American people. This document shows that as the public discovered that government officials had concealed the reality of the war, public trust was demolished because the American people felt lied to by their own country. This document and article is monumental because before this was released, the United States people were convinced that we were succeeding in the war, but this article clearly proves that wrong. This next piece is from an interview between Ellsberg and the NPR News. In the interview, Ellsberg openly shares how he released the documents because he was frustrated with the government's continuous lies to the American people and how they were still continuing to send out troops to fight when in private the government knew that the war was a stalemate. The purpose of what Ellsberg said was to expose deception and inform the public about the government's continuous lies. This moment shows explicitly how, with the papers being released, the gap between the government and citizens deepened due to outrage of continuous lies and dishonesty. The release of the Pentagon Papers was highly influential in opening the door for future whistleblowers, and this next document shows why. This document shows how many times following the incident, the Nixon administration tried to stop the New York Times from publishing more documents with the argument that it is a threat to national security. Nonetheless, when the case was taken to the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the New York Times, ultimately restricting the government's ability to stop the press from publishing more documents. With the Supreme Court decision, the First Amendment for many Americans and journalists is protected, and this has allowed many people who were originally scared to pursue investigative journaling to feel more confident and inclined to follow through with that career. Similar to the previous document, Document 4 also shows how the release of the Pentagon Papers opened the door for whistleblowers and investigative journalists. Document 4 shows that the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the New York Times because restraining the journalists is a violation of the First Amendment. Since the First Amendment was granted, many whistleblowers who were hesitant to investigate now feel protected by the court. In addition, the purpose of the document is to inform the readers of the relevance that government control over information should stay limited, and freedom of the press should be granted. As a result of this, journalists acquired access to much stronger legal protections, and today, many whistleblowers feel more inclined and supported to release classified information. And finally, Document 5 shows how the publication of the papers eroded public support for the Vietnam War because it exposes the human and political costs of the conflict. This document shows how millions of Americans who initially showed support for the war later found out about the hard truths and that the government was lying to them. In Document 5, veteran John Kerry condemned government officials for continuously sending out troops to fight in dangerous circumstances while also spreading false information about the war to the public. Kerry's point of view is critical because he was a puppet for the government to send out to fight, and he witnessed firsthand the gruesome reality of the war. Kerry's statement encouraged many Americans to feel outraged with its government for continuously lying and sending troops into the war unnecessarily. Once the American people found out about the realities through the papers and veterans like Kerry, they felt dissatisfied with the war and against it. In conclusion, even though the release of the Pentagon Papers did compel the U.S. government to be more honest with its citizens, it served an even greater role as a catalyst for the deepening divide between the government and the American people. This was through fueling distrust, opening the door for future whistleblowers, and diminishing public support for the Vietnam War. Overall, the release of the Pentagon Papers profoundly shaped American society and changed how Americans view their country, and most importantly, left a huge mark on this nation.